Don't run too fast, Domingo.
Thank you, Pastor. Hey, hello, everyone. And the sermon text today is in Mark chapter 5, and we're going to be reading verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman who had been the subject of bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she actually grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the sermon text for today.
And now, gracious and wonderful Father, we expect to hear from you that your sacred word, your living word, would speak to the human need in the midst of our brokenness and our sinfulness, that you will bring healing to us. We have great need of a rhema word from you, Lord. So, with expectancy, we wait. Speak now. Speak to us where we are and help us to move to where we should be in you. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, we've been preaching through a sermon series from the book of Mark. And today we want to continue in that series. I'll be there shortly. Now, many of us think that we're patient. But patience is not just waiting and enduring, it is how and why you do so. Philip Brooks, a Boston pastor, when once asked the reason for his agitation, answered this way. He says, "The trouble is that I'm in a hurry, but God isn't." Often, encountering Jesus requires patience, but we don't know why until after the fact. Take this story in Mark chapter 5 and verses 21 through 43. It's actually not two stories, it's one story with two characters in it. In Mark chapter 5 and verses 21 through 43, Jesus has just crossed back over to the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee after he had healed a demon-possessed man on the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee. And word of his miracles and the amazing things he had done had continued to spread, and people were following him everywhere. And so once he came back onto the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, a large crowd of people gathered around him. And one of the people who gathered around him or who came to him, was a synagogue leader by the name of Jairus. Now, Jairus didn't just come to him. Jairus pretty much pushed his way to the front of the crowd. And Jairus was a synagogue leader. It was an administrative position. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a teacher. He was an administrator. He administrated the house of worship. He was responsible for supervising worship, for running the weekly school, and caring for the synagogue building. In general, these rulers were not supporters of Jesus. And so this was an unusual thing for this man to push his way through the crowd and to come to the attention of Jesus. And he did a very, very strange thing. What is interesting is that he fell down before Jesus and begged. That's not something that a Jewish man and a Jewish religious leader, administrator would do. It's unheard of for a man of such social standing. But we'll discover something about this man. This man was desperate. Which reminds us that often we are driven by desperation to consider Jesus. We're driven by desperation in most of our encounters with Jesus. And the reason why this man was desperate is it says that his daughter was dying. She was sick and she was dying. This man was so desperate because of his daughter. There are some things that your influence and your wealth and your reputation and your fame and your resources cannot fix. I think we have learned that with the coronavirus. I think we've learned that with COVID-19. It doesn't discriminate. And so rich and poor and in between have been desperate to not get this virus. But Jairus was in a desperate situation. His only child, his only daughter, a 12-year-old girl, was sick and dying. Despite all of his resources, despite all of his efforts, she was dying. Now, when he thought about his daughter, he wasn't thinking about just a little girl. He was thinking about all of his dreams and all of his excitement about the day that his daughter would be married. A Jewish girl became a woman at age 12. So this man was thinking about the day when he would be walking his daughter down the aisle, and they would sing, "Here comes the bride, here comes the bride," with her daddy at her side. He was thinking that. That's what was in his mind, and that was about to be taken away from him. His heritage and his future in his children and grandchildren was about to be taken away because she was sick. He was desperate. Jesus was his last resort, and Jairus needed to know that Jesus would act right now on his behalf and lay hands on his daughter so that she could be healed. Boy, he must have been excited and ecstatic when Jesus said he would go with him, because the man begged Jesus. And now Jesus responded to him, and he had hope. He had the excitement of the opportunity for his daughter to recover. The quality of his faith did not matter. It was who he put his faith in. He was putting his faith in Jesus. We don't know what was the depth of his faith. All we know is that when Jesus spoke and said, I'll come with you, the man had hope. But his desperate faith was about to be challenged. Which brings us back to the whole idea of patience. Jairus was in a hurry, but Jesus was not. And on the way to the house of Jairus, a large crowd followed Jesus, probably waiting to see another miracle. They were just spectators, not believers, not yet. And everything seemed to be going well. But patience was about to come onto the scene. There was a woman in this crowd who had to push her way through the crowd to get to Jesus. But she too was driven by desperation to consider Jesus. That's what I mean when often we are driven by desperation to consider Jesus. This woman, she too was desperate. You see, for 12 years, the number 12 comes up again here, but for 12 years, she has been experiencing this constant bleeding and hemorrhaging. It was like having a non-stop menstrual cycle. It was like having a blood flow that perpetually. It would be a horrible thing to have to do that every day and to know you can't control it and it never stops. She wasn't just suffering from this disease. She was also suffering from the cure. Because apparently she had spent all of her resources, all of her limited resources on seeking out cures. And by the way, I was reading something just this week, and they were talking about some of the ridiculous things that people prescribe for a condition such as hers. And here's some of the things that the Jewish Talmud listed a number of costly cures for her condition. Tonics, medicines, such as carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen bag in summer and a cotton bag in winter, to carrying barley corn found in the dung of a donkey. You can think about it. This woman had spent all of her resources, and the cures weren't curing her. They were probably making her worse. So she was suffering twofold. And as a result of this disease, she couldn't marry, she couldn't work or travel far, and she was an outcast of society because her condition made her ceremonially unclean. And anybody who touched her was also unclean. So she had to be careful, even as she was pushing through this crowd. She had to cover her head and cover her face so that no one would know that this was the woman who's been sick for 12 years, and she is touching everybody as she pushes through the crowd. She had to be careful not to be seen touching any of them because that made them unclean as well. She'd probably heard about Jesus and believed that if she could touch him without him noticing, that she would be healed because there would be something magical about touching his clothes. And so she did that. She touched the corner of one of his tassels and she was healed. But something interesting happened as she touched Jesus. He felt the release of power from him and knew that someone had touched him and had been healed. And he stopped. And he asked, "Who touched me?" And that's a strange question to ask. Why would he need to know who touched him? Well, I suspect, and I think you're going to discover later in this story, that he wanted more from this woman than to just heal her at a distance. But we'll talk more about that later. This woman had to be patient with Jesus. Because it wasn't over yet. Even though she was healed, it wasn't over yet. She had to be patient with Jesus. Which brings us back now to Jairus, because remember, they were on their way to Jairus' house. And Jairus was full of hope and expectation that his daughter could be healed. You could only imagine how Jairus was feeling at this time and how he was thinking in his mind about Jesus and what was while all of this was happening. His daughter was dying, and here's Jesus stopping to have a conversation with a no-name woman who had already been healed of a non-life-threatening condition. Well, non-life-threatening in the sense of maybe physically. She could probably go on living with this disease physically for many years, but emotionally and psychologically, she was being devastated. But Jairus was already desperate and fearful and in a hurry, but Jesus was not in a hurry. He stopped to talk with this woman, and he literally put Jairus on hold. This made no sense. And Jairus' worst fears were realized as soon as this hemorrhaging woman was healed, because he received news now that his daughter had died while Jesus stopped to talk to this woman and to heal this woman. That must have been like a stake in his heart. That was like the last straw that could break the camel's back. It's like a stake in his heart. And his desperate faith in Jesus now was being tested because somebody in the crowd says, well, why don't even bother to go home because your daughter's dead. Well, some people can be very insensitive. But he was about to discover a very important fact about Jesus. Jesus heals across social and gender lines. These are not an issue. Jesus heals across social and gender lines. Jesus had already healed a desperate, poor, outcast female, and now he would heal the daughter of an important community leader. See, Jesus does not discriminate. He doesn't care if you are an outsider or an insider, an upsider or a downsider. Jesus heals across social and gender lines. Jesus does not discriminate because everyone needs the healing of Jesus. But Jairus didn't really understand that at this moment. He thought that Jesus had let him down. And when Jesus heard him talking with these men, instead of getting upset, Jesus actually turned to him and really told him, in a sense, to relax, trust me, be patient. Something's coming. Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of England and the first female Prime Minister of England, I believe, said, I'm extraordinarily patient, provided I get my own way in the end. Well, Jairus was not about to get his own way at that moment, but he still had faith in Jesus. But there's an important reason I want you to understand why Jesus delayed this healing from death and had made the hemorrhaging woman come forward after she was healed. It's all connected. Jesus is saying that there's more to me than you know, and I am more than just another traveling healer, another traveling magician. Jesus wants us to know. Jesus asks more of us and gives more to us than we know to do or to ask. He wants us to know that. He asks more of us and gives more to us than we know to do or to ask. And folks, that requires what? Patience. Patience. See, Jesus, as much as he loves us, as much as he loves us all, as much as he would die for us, and as much as he would give everything for us, Jesus does not act on our timeline. He can't be controlled. He can't be manipulated. He can't be rushed. We have to trust him, to see everything from an eternal perspective. And it's always been more than just about, it's always been about more than just our immediate need or our immediate request or our immediate perspective. J.I. Packer, a Scottish theologian who recently passed away, said this: patience means living out the belief that God orders everything for the spiritual good of his children. And that's true of Jesus. This means trusting Jesus even when things aren't working out as you wanted them to work out initially. I think about this with many things in my life. I think about this about marriage. I think about this about several jobs I've had. I think about this about ministry. Jesus always knows best, for he loves us more than we could really understand until he shows us as he holds our hands. He has to hold our hand and let us know how much he loves us. And I'm not going to give you what you want or what you requested of me right now necessarily, because there's something bigger that I have for you. Well, I don't know if you remember earlier, and we don't want to forget in the story, that Jesus forced the hemorrhaging woman to come forward and publicly acknowledge her healing. Why would he do that? Why not just let her slip away quietly in the crowd? But Jesus had something bigger for her than just physical healing. He wanted her to know him, and to know it wasn't just about touching the hem of his, the tassel of his garment. It was about knowing him and about being touched by him. He wanted her to know him, to know his love. And how do I know that? Because he called her daughter. Daughter. You're mine. You're my daughter. He wanted her to know him and to know his love and to know his power. It was all connected. He wanted her to know it wasn't her touching him that healed her, but her faith in him. That's what set him apart from all of the healers and magicians that went around. It was about knowing him. But she couldn't control Jesus. She couldn't be healed by Jesus and just run and hide. She was forced from faith concealed to faith revealed. Jesus wanted her to declare her faith in him. And on top of that, as she declared her faith in him, Jesus wanted to make it known that she was no longer a social outcast and a spiritual outcast. She had been accepted back into the community. She was part of the community of God, the community of faith, the community of people. Because she's now healed, she is no longer unclean. But now it's Jairus' turn. Because Jesus says, I want you to, Jairus, to enter into this reality. Remember, the story tells us that Jesus goes to see Jairus' dead daughter, and he only takes Peter and James and John. And the festivities and the ceremony of grieving has already begun. People are probably already wailing and crying over this 12-year-old child's death. And so Jesus approaches them and he addresses the professional weepers with a bit of a rebuke and a strong statement. And he says, she is not dead, but asleep. Jesus knew she was dead, But he wanted Jairus and everyone else to understand who he was. And that he was to have authority over death. And he took this girl calmly by the hand and he said, "Baby girl, get up. Get up, baby girl." That's a term of endearment. And by the way, he noticed that he took her by the hand. A Jewish rabbi made himself unclean by touching a dead person. And so by his touch and tone, he showed his love for her. And he showed his willingness to identify with her death and her uncleanness because she was dead. He showed the greatest love. It wasn't love at a distance. It was a love that was engaged. And by his touch and tone, he showed his love for her and for Jairus and his authority over our greatest enemy, death. As one writer put it, Jesus is saying by his actions, "If I have you by the hand, death itself is nothing but sleep." And when Jesus has us by the hand, we all have to know that death is nothing but sleep. It's nothing to be feared. Because we are in the hands of the one who's overcome death. And amazingly, this little girl got up. I couldn't even imagine what everybody was thinking about. Whoa! That would have been like a shock. She got up and began to act normally to the amazement of her parents and disciples. And to prove that she was really alive, he asked them to give her some food to eat. This is amazing. But folks, you don't really understand fully what was happening here. This event was a foreshadow of what Jesus was to go through on our behalf and why we should have to be patient and put our trust in him. When he was crucified, it took patience to wait 3 days and see that his crucifixion was setting up his resurrection. And because Jesus suffered and died in our place on the cross, by faith in him, we could share in his resurrection life, even in the darkest moments when we are walking through the valley of the shadow of death. We have to trust him and be patient. Wait on him. Now, I don't know if any of you here, or those of you who are listening, have ever heard about the Chinese bamboo tree. But I'm sure you have. From what I've been told, when the Chinese are planting the seed of a Chinese bamboo tree, they water and fertilize it, but the first year, nothing happens. The second year, they water it and they fertilize it, and nothing happens. The third and fourth years, they water it and fertilize it, and nothing happens. But then the fifth year, they water and fertilize it, and something happens during the course of that fifth year. In a period of approximately 6 weeks, the bamboo tree grows roughly about 90 feet. And the question is asked, did it grow 90 feet in 6 weeks, or did it grow 90 feet in 5 years? The obvious answer is that it grew 90 feet in 5 years, because had they not watered and fertilized the tree every one of those 5 years, there would have been no Chinese bamboo tree. Well, folks, friends, brothers and sisters, all of us have these Chinese bamboo tree experiences with Jesus. It will often seem as if Jesus has not heard us, that he is not acting on our behalf, but in fact, it's the opposite. Jesus is patiently working on reshaping us into his image if we put our faith in him. And it takes time. But eventually, a bamboo tree will grow and will seem to come out of nowhere. But it didn't come out of nowhere. Jesus has been at work. Because Jesus asks more of us and gives more to us than we know to do or to ask. We ask for healing and deliverance. He asks us to know him and to trust him with everything we have and everything that we are and everything that we will do for all eternity so we can become more like him in time. That's what we were created to look like. This sermon was titled, I Will Be There Shortly. I titled it that way because Jesus is saying to us, he will be on time to accomplish his eternal purposes in our lives, which is always more than we can ask for or receive or even think about. And so Jesus is asking us today to cooperate with him. And when we encounter him and we become aware of his presence in our lives, to say yes to him because he wants to have a relationship with us. Yes, I believe in you. Yes, I will follow you on this life-changing journey. Yes. And not just today, but tomorrow and the next day and the next day. I will follow you. I will believe in you. I will trust you. And yes, Jesus can heal you from your sin and all the maladies of life, but only if you put your faith in him. Put your faith in Jesus and continue faith in him, empowered by the Holy Spirit, so that when we are driven by desperation to consider him, that we can know of his healing that reaches across social and racial and gender lines. Because then we will understand that Jesus asks more of us and gives more to us than we know to do or to ask for. That's the nature of the Jesus that we know. Today, we have an opportunity to express in a wondrous and powerful way how much Jesus has meant to us and how much Jesus continues to mean to us. And I'm talking about communion. Today we are going to take communion together. And as we take communion together, we are celebrating and remembering and reimagining what it meant that Jesus has died for us, was resurrected for us, and will soon come back for us. And for those of you who don't know Jesus, I desire that you would come to put your faith in him so that you too can participate in this celebration of communion in the Lord's Supper. If you are at home right now, I ask you to take a moment to get your elements together. And for those of us who are here, I would ask